Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint and Office 365 Community Webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by Toni Frankola, who will be talking to you about permission management in SharePoint, overview and best practice. Remember to join the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC16. Also, attend any webinar in Training Week and your name will be entered into a draw to win a 3-day ticket to the European SharePoint Conference in Vienna, Austria. Also, hotels are filling up fast, so get booking. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you have for Toni in the questions window. Some questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. And now, I'm going to hand you over to our webinar presenter, Toni Frankola. Hello, Toni.
Hello, Shane, and hello, everyone, and welcome to our today's webinar. Hello from Zagreb, Croatia. So, hi, everyone. I'm just going to turn off my camera to conserve the bandwidth, and I'm just going to switch to my slides. So just give me 1 second here. Okay. And if everything is okay, Shane, can you see the presentation?
I can see the presentation, Toni. Take it away.
Okay. So thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar regarding SharePoint permissions. My name is Toni Frankola, and I'm co-founder and CEO of Acceleratio Croatia. We manufacture software applications for SharePoint administrators, Windows administrators, Office 365 administrators that help them be more proactive and manage their infrastructure in a more efficient way. I have been working in the Microsoft ecosystem for the last 16 years, and I have been running Acceleratio for the last 7. I'm also Office Server and Services MVP. Since 2010. It's very common topic in these days to mention how long you have been using SharePoint. I have never used SharePoint 2001, but I have been working in production with SharePoint since SharePoint 2003. So what we do and what I do on a daily basis, we have 4 different applications that help you manage your infrastructure. As I said, we have Syskit for server management, SQL Duckit for SQL server management, and SP Duckit and CloudKit for SharePoint and Office 365 administration. Both tools, our tools, help you manage your infrastructure. So SP Duckit helps you create inventory of your farm, analyze the best practices, and help you govern the system. And when it comes to permissions, we do a lot of reporting, management, and compare of features or compare of existing permissions and help you be more proactive with that. So a lot of what I'm going to talk today is based on what we have learned when working with very large organizations and very large customers and helping them to be more efficient with managing permissions and solving problems that occur when you are working with SharePoint permissions. Our other tool is CloudKit 365 that does the same for your SharePoint Online and your entire Office 365 tenancy, helps you manage permissions and create inventory reports. Okay, so that was a quick intro of what I'm doing and is my background in SharePoint. So for today's topics, I have divided this presentation into 2 sections. We are going to talk about general terminology. So I'm going to introduce all the terms that are being used when we are talking about SharePoint permissions and SharePoint in general. This webinar is aimed for a person that needs to get like a broad overview of all the topics and everything that's inside SharePoint. So if you are a SharePoint expert, this might be a little bit boring to you, but if you are learning and trying to understand all the topics and everything that's inside SharePoint and you're trying to extend your knowledge, this is going to be useful, I hope, and you're going to see a lot of stuff that might be useful to be a better administrator and better manage your SharePoint in terms of permissions. I'm also going to compare how these features are different between different versions of SharePoint and different editions. So we have a lot of SharePoints around, so you're going to see in the next slide what exactly is available and how these things affect every SharePoint administrator. I'm also going to talk something about features, something about limitations, something that cannot be done in SharePoint with current technology, or cannot be done in some specific SharePoint version or SharePoint edition. And I'm going to wrap it up with best practices. So I have written everything I could think of that is like a best practice and that should be done by a SharePoint administrator. I'm sure there are going to be some questions regarding how do I do this and how do I do that, and I'm going to try to answer these questions at the very end. And then we have a demo where I'm going to connect to my SharePoint and show you live some of the things we were discussing before, just that you get a sense of how these things work and what can be done with certain stuff. So for this webinar, I'm not going to talk anything about SharePoint 2003 because, to be honest, I forgot how SharePoint 2003 looks like these days. So I'm just going to focus on SharePoint 2007, 2010, 2013, and 2016, and especially on SharePoint Online, which is like the version that you have in the cloud. In terms of editions, for this particular webinar, there is no differences. So all the features are available regardless if you have a SharePoint Foundation or if you have WSS 3.0 or a standard or enterprise editions of SharePoint. So there is, when it comes to permissions, especially for this part that I'm going to talk to you about today, there is no, between editions, there is no differences that are something that I need to mention especially. So when we talk about permissions, the keystone of everything that we need to do in terms of permission is a user. So a user is an individual that can access your SharePoint site. So, for example, Shane is a user, Toni is a user, Mary, she is a user as well. So anybody that connects to a SharePoint site is a user. When it comes to users, the key element for efficient user management is Active Directory. So for all the on-premises SharePoint installations, 2007 to 2016, you need to have an Active Directory in order to be able to install and configure such a system. So an Active Directory is supported for all the SharePoint versions from 2007 to 2016. And Active Directory is actually like a directory of all the users and all the groups and all the computers that you have in your organization. So in order to start working with SharePoint, you need to, of course, have an Active Directory. In some versions of SharePoint, from 2010 and later, Microsoft introduced some additional abilities to be able to authenticate some users that are not in the Active Directory. So you need to have an Active Directory to install SharePoint and configure it on a server, but you don't need to have all the users in Active Directory. You can configure system to work in such a way that you have some third-party authentication directory, like you can work with out-of-the-box ISP.NET membership providers, or you can have some other directory that stores your users, and then you can use these users to give them permissions for these objects in SharePoint. For SharePoint Online, we have a Azure AD. So this is like a cloud version of AD. And Azure AD helps me, I'm sorry. I have sore throat today, so just 1 second. So Azure AD is a component, a cloud version of Active Directory that stands in the background of SharePoint Online, and this helps me to authenticate my users and to store my users in the cloud. There are various ways of how you can connect your on-premises installation with your Azure AD, but this is beyond the scope of this webinar. So just to know that there is such a component and it's used to authenticate your users in SharePoint Online. Of course, as you can see on this picture, it looks a little bit more modern than Active Directory, which is in the middle of the screen, and Azure AD looks a little bit more modern, but it basically provides, when it comes to SharePoint, basic functionality to authenticate you and store your users in the Active Directory. In SharePoint Online, we have one additional feature, and this one additional feature is called external users. So as I said, if you have something on-premise, you need to have everybody in Active Directory. In SharePoint Online, you can invite additional people. So this is a definition from Microsoft website. So external user is somebody who is not employed in your company. So if, for example, Shane and I, we are not employed in the same company, and if I wanted to collaborate on this presentation with Shane, I can invite him to my SharePoint Online, and he can collaborate with me as an external user, and I don't need to pay a license for him. So some of the key benefits is of this external user feature is you don't need to pay for a license, so I don't need to pay a license for Shane so he can edit this presentation on my SharePoint Online. It's very easy to invite additional people to join, so everything is set up. When you talk about SharePoint Online, everything is configured, so I just need to type Shane's email and he will be able to join my SharePoint Online. He just needs to provision an account or use his existing Live ID or Azure AD account, and he will be able to join my presentation and edit the presentation with me. So this is very useful for collaboration between companies and working on projects and stuff like that. So as he's only connecting to my SharePoint Online, he doesn't need to access any kind of internal infrastructure that I might have in my company, so everything is very transparent and very easy to use. So as I said, you would definitely want to use this for projects if you have any kind of projects with other companies. Similar architecture can be configured even if you have SharePoint on premises, but it requires some additional work on from your system admins, and this is beyond the scope of this webinar. But just if you need something like this, this can be configured on premises as well. So we said we have the basic component, building component for SharePoint permissions is a user, and now we are moving forward. We have something we call a SharePoint group. So as the name indicates, this is a group that is just like a collection of users. What is very convenient for you guys is you can create these groups from a SharePoint interface. So any site collection administrators or anybody who has permissions inside of SharePoint can create groups, and they are basic building block to grant permissions, as you will see in the slides that are coming. So you'll definitely want to use groups in many situations. There is one downside of SharePoint groups, and this downside is that SharePoint groups don't support nested groups. So you cannot create, let's say, a group that you want to call finance team, and then have another group that's called a London finance team inside of this group. So they're flat, and you can only add one level of members inside of this group. So these members can either be users or Active Directory groups, and we are going to get to Active Directory groups in just 1 second. So one different type of group, Active Directory group that exists in SharePoint on-premises world. It has a slightly different name in SharePoint Online, but it's the same thing. They're calling this a security group in Office 365 administration. So it's basically the same thing, because even the Active Directory group is the security group in Active Directory. So if you see the different terms, both groups provide the same functionality. What is good? These groups can be nested, and you can do this. You can do this inside of Active Directory. So the scenario that I just described, where you have a finance team and then you want to have a subgroup called the London finance team, you can do this in Active. And then SharePoint leverages all the entire structure of the Active Directory and all the people that are inside these nested groups will have proper privileges. There are some downsides of these groups, and that is you cannot manage members from SharePoint, and you cannot even see the members from the SharePoint interface. So this is kind of a downside. So imagine if you're working for a larger corporation where SharePoint administrator is not necessarily also your directory administrator. That means when SharePoint administrator wants to create new sites and grant permissions and create groups, he needs to go through a lot of steps to get his directory administrator or directory administrator's team to approve and create all the groups the SharePoint administrator needs. So it can take a lot of time to manage and even to update in the future. So this is like a little bit of a blocking step if you want to leverage all the benefits that AD groups provide. So you will need to have either a good workflow in place to make sure that you get all the groups when you need them, or just to ensure that you have access to the right people who will be able to provide and create groups for you. So we talked about users, we talked about groups, and now the third element that we need to prepare our meal is permission level. So a permission level is a collection of individual permissions that allow users to do something in SharePoint. So if we take a look at this table, I wanted to show you this before. So what is a permission? So permission gives you a right to do something in SharePoint. So for example, if I want to grant my users the right to add new documents, I would need to give them add items permission. If I would like to give somebody permission to manage other permissions, I would need to give this permission, and things and so on. So for example, if somebody wants to have the ability to create groups, he would need to do this. I'll just go back for a sec. So a permission level is a collection of these features. So for example, these are the built-in permission levels. So these are the permission levels that are delivered with SharePoint. These are the English names. If you have a localized version of SharePoint, this is going to be in your language. So, but basically you get these basic permission levels, and you can achieve the majority of SharePoint administrator tasks, and the majority of, you can fulfill a majority of scenarios with just these basic or out-of-the-box permission levels that can be used. So for example, if somebody is an administrator of a SharePoint site, you would give him or her a full control. So this gives him entire and everything that can be done in SharePoint can be done with full control. And if you just need some users that need to contribute on documents and create new documents and create document libraries and stuff like that, then a contribute permission level would be suitable, and you can use this permission level to use for the people that need to work and contribute. And if you just want to give people access to documents without giving them the ability to change anything, you would give them a read permission level, and then they would be able to just read the documents without making any changes. And the interface is going to adapt, and they're only going to see or be able to do stuff that they are allowed to. So people that don't have a contribute permission are not going to be able to see all the buttons that are for editing stuff and modifying, making changes to documents and things like that. There is a link, so the presentation will be available for you, so you'll be able to download the presentation, and the link here describes all the default permission levels, and it also lists in every single permission that's inside of these permission levels. So if you're not sure what exactly this user can do with the permission level, this is a list of permissions, and then you can see what exactly this user can do and why he has been given this permission. But for majority of scenarios and for a number of businesses, if you just go with the default permission levels, this is going to be more than enough, and you will be able to fulfill most of business requirements with just doing these with the out-of-the-box permission levels. Of course, there are situations where out-of-the-box permission levels are not good enough for you, and you have a business requirement where this is something that you need to do. For example, if you have a situation where you want to give people contribute permission, and that means, just to summarize, the ability to create